I wanted to start by saying on November 11th, 3 days after the election, I wrote of Trump and his voters. He spoke directly to people who wanted to be seen and heard. He aimed his campaign and his message at them. Though his facts were wrong, his story was right. I imagined a Trump supporter. So now, I've got a major political candidate talking to me, and he's not just a nerdy politician. He's a macho, successful, celebrity, billionaire businessman and TV star. And he understands me. He respects me. He cares about me. And you want to base your whole campaign on running him down, telling me he's not good enough to be president. Where have I heard that before? Not good enough. And several minutes into the first debate with Hillary, I turned to my wife and I said, we're in trouble. He's a narrative machine. And from that night forward, I knew Trump's election was a serious possibility. Scott Adams, looking at the man and his campaign from a highly informed perspective, saw much more than I did. Adams calls Trump the most persuasive human being he's ever observed, and he predicted Trump's win was 98% certain a week after Nate Silver said he had a 2% chance. And as Ted said in his latest book, Win Bigly, Adams not only offers a look at the persuasion strategies that Trump used, but he goes beyond politics to look at persuasion strategies that can work for you anywhere. I won't do the bio because Ted just did. But Scott, as I mentioned to you backstage, I like listeners to get a feel for the people, not just the book or the ideas. So tell us a little bit about how you see your path, which is not a normal one by any means.
You mean the path to cartooning?
The path well, no, you start in, you're working in tech and corporations, and then you diverge into cartooning, and somewhere there's hypnotism. And
Well, so I'll give you the fast-forward version. At the age of 6, I saw my first Peanuts cartoon book, and I couldn't read yet, but I said, finally, a reason to learn to read. I want to know what this is all about. And at about that age, I decided to become a famous cartoonist, because I thought, well, I saw other jobs, like farmer, mailman. I was like, those don't look nearly as good as this. So let's see if I can do that. But around about the age of 11, you become rational, and you say, wait, there are 5 billion people or whatever there were at the time, only one Charles Schultz? I don't like my odds. So I put that on hold for many years, did the corporate route, worked for a big bank, a number of jobs, worked at the phone company, did a number of jobs. And when my career stalled at both of those places, now that enough time has gone by, I can tell you the real reason that my career stalled in both places. At the bank, my boss called me in one day, and there was an opening for a promotion, and I was sort of the obvious person for it. I was kind of an up-and-comer, was working on my MBA and everything. And she said, I don't know how to tell you this, but the company is getting in a lot of heat because we have no diversity in senior management. And she said, until further notice, we can't promote you because you're a white male. And I said, well, how long is that going to last? And she's like, well, how long did it take us to get to this point? It's not going to be fast. So I started looking for a new job right away, thinking, okay, I'm not going to let that slow me down. Went to the phone company and worked there. Got on the fast track, was recognized as a up-and-comer. And one day my boss called me into his office. He said, the local newspaper's all over us. They just discovered we have no diversity in senior management. And we just can't promote you, and I don't know when that's going to change. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that was a bad day for me, right? But you'd be wrong, because it turns out that the day you find out that your effort and your reward are not related, it really frees up your schedule. So suddenly I had time for working on side projects, and I thought, well, let's see if I can have a comic published somewhere. And I asked for some advice from a cartoonist I'd seen on TV. He sent me some advice. He said, it's a tough business, but here's some tips, where to send your comics, that sort of thing. Sent out some comics to some magazines. They were rejected immediately. I gave up. A year later, I get a letter from the same cartoonist, Jack Cassidy was his name, And he said he was cleaning his office, came across my letter that was still in a pile, and he said he was just writing to make sure that I hadn't given up.
I mean, that's an important moment.
Yeah, it was the only point of the letter. There was nothing else in it. And I had given up. So I took my materials up and I decided to raise my sights and try to become a famous cartoonist in newspapers all over the world, and I created Dilbert. So that was the beginning of Dilbert.
Was Dilbert originally multi-panel?
Yeah. When I sent it to magazines, I single-paneled it.
Right. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and then it became 3. A lot of cartoonists do 4 panels, but I was also a trained economist, and thinking that's 1/3 harder than my 3-panel idea. And then fast forward, worked for the phone company while doing Dilbert until it took off. And then it was 2015, and I'm sitting in front of my TV like everybody else, and I'm seeing this orange ball of fury who's just got everybody jabbering. And I started to notice, because I have a background as a hypnotist. So I'm a trained hypnotist.
But let me ask, because I was curious, you mentioned I'm a hypnotist. When was that? High school, junior high, later? When did you?
Early 20s, and I was influenced by my mother, who was hypnotized to give birth to my younger sister. And my mother reported that she was, awake and aware, used no painkillers, and had a painless delivery. And I thought, well, what is this superpower? I got to learn about this. Now, it turns out that maybe 1 in 5 people could have that kind of effect. Most people can't. She just happened to be one of them. But I thought, I got to learn what this superpower is to add it to my other resources.
And so, I interrupted you, but so being a trained hypnotist, people might not make the immediate connection, how that, immediately leads to your interpretation, if you will, the way that you saw Donald Trump.
So, on top of hypnosis, I had also studied persuasion in all of its forms, from communicating, everything from listening to design to writing, and it helps in my work. The Dilbert comic is designed with persuasion mechanics, and I could talk about that later. But when I saw Trump, I didn't know that much about him. I knew his public figure, but I hadn't seen much of him. And I quickly noticed that he was using what I call weapons-grade persuasion, the type of thing that was essentially he was bringing a flamethrower to a stick fight, and there were no sticks that could see it. It was like his hands were like this, but there was nothing in them. It was like, hey, watch this. Because if you don't study it, you don't notice it. It just looks random, it looks crazy, it looks provocative, and you say, well, this guy could never get elected with all this crazy, random, provocative behavior. And I'm looking at it and saying, oh my God, that's perfect. And it was so consistent.
Yeah. As I said, my analysis was on the narrative story thing, because that's what I look for. I consult organizations about story, and I just saw this guy, everything is a story. Let me talk just a little bit more about Dilbert, because I'm sure there are some people that are here, partially at least, because of that. How do you write Dilbert?
Well, it's changed over the years. I used to do one a day and do it on paper with a pencil, and then ink over it with a pen, and take it down to the post office, which worked until the post office figured out who I was, and then they just steal them. So, which actually was a common problem for cartoonists in those days. As soon as they figured out who you were, they're like, hey, these will disappear. But now I do on a Wacom Cintiq. It's a big computer screen that's made for drawing with a stylus. So I got a hand problem that caused me to move to it, but it probably reduced my workload by 70%. The drawings are simple. The words, the exchanges are the juice there. Do you write them out? How's the you know what I'm saying? The writing and the drawing. How does that relate? So in the early days, I would write a sentence, draw it, write, draw, and I didn't know where it was going or how it was going to end. And that ended up being almost a trademark approach because it violated what was the standard da-da-da-da-da punchline, and so and it turned out to be the beginning of what I would call the age of realism being humor. Because if you look at humor, it's changed over the years from, vaudeville, punchline-y stuff, and then in the 70s it was SNL, and it's like, can we say masturbation on TV? That's funny, because it was just violating, expectations. But if you look at what qualifies as humor today, and really for the last, number of years, it's reality.
Yeah.
We watch reality TV shows to laugh. We watch politics. How many of you have laughed watching the news, right? You watch it like it's almost designed as humor because it's so often funny.
Yeah.
So that's what we see as humor now. Anyway, so currently, I'm more likely to write it first and then draw it second, but it's evolved over time.
Right. And in case you're wondering, he wrote a few ahead so he could be here with us.
Yeah, there are no blank spaces in your newspaper.
And so you talked about how the technology has changed and so on. How has the culture in the Strip changed as the economy goes up and down, as tech goes up and down?
Yeah.
What are some things about that little world that lives inside those panels?
Well, it changes with society, right? So I'm trying to mirror society. In the 90s, the bosses had all the power, and they were firing people, so you were just scrambling to keep your job. But now, if you're an engineer like Dilbert is and his coworkers, they have more power, so they're much more insolent and more likely to insult their boss to his face because they're hard to replace. So I move with the times.
Okay. So now we're going to switch to Win Bigly. You're sitting there in 2015. He comes down the escalator. You watch a couple of debates probably or even rallies, and you see this thing. How soon did you know this was something you had to write about, and then how soon did you know it might even be a book?
Well, I can't remember exactly what keyed me off, but I remember the two big confirmation points. One was the first debate where he got the question from Megyn Kelly about his comments about women. Any normal politician dies that day. That's the kill shot. It's over. It doesn't matter what you say. You can't apologize. You can't explain it away. It's over. And what does he do?
Oh, by the way, let me just cut in for a sec. If people remember, that wasn't the big grabbing line. That was just, you've called them pigs. You've called them, I'm just setting the...
Right. So that's back in 2015, August, I think. And what does he do? Instead of engaging in like a normal human being, he cuts her off and he goes, only Rosie O'Donnell. The room erupts. Right? So remember, his base had a real strong feeling about Rosie O'Donnell. But here's the first confirmation point. It's visual. All right? That was the first thing I saw. Wait, this is visual. He took all of our energy from the question to the answer, and the genius was, it wasn't an answer. It wasn't even an answer to the question. But you almost didn't care because it was so entertaining. Your energy just moved there. Now, if you're wondering, well, was that just a lucky play? I remind you, you may not have seen this, but there was an interview many months later with Chris Cuomo on CNN, and he asked him another gotcha question that was just as good. It was an impossible trap, and here was the question. Imagine how you would answer this. He said, the Pope has said some bad things about capitalism. What do you say to the Pope? Now, what's he do? Say bad things about capitalism while he's running for president of the United States? No. Say bad things about the Pope when you're running for president? No, there's no way out. So what does he say? I'd tell the Pope to worry about ISIS taking over the Vatican. Right? What was the question? I don't know. They never got back to the question. It didn't matter. Again, it's visual. It's provocative. It takes your energy out. But before that, to answer the question, the second real confirmation was the low energy Jeb. Right. I felt I was a little bit out on a line because I started writing about his powers of persuasion based on the first clues, but it could have been wrong. I mean, maybe
could
it
have
was
been
luck.
Could have been, yeah.
Maybe luck. You never know. But by the time you got to low energy Jeb, and that's just so engineered compared to regular insults, and I could talk about that later or now if you like. But that was deep technique, which would be invisible to the audience, the people who haven't had that training. They wouldn't see how much goes into them. They're not random at all.
So let's
talk about that.
Let's do that for him.
So let me contrast it to the bad attempts that people used about him. One of the ones that somebody on the Clinton side came up with was Dangerous Donald. Problem, his supporters wanted a dangerous candidate. They wanted somebody who would beat ISIS hard, somebody who would drain the swamp. Danger was too easy to flip to a positive. They also tried, this was my favorite, Cheeto Jesus. Remember that one? Which is hilarious. It's diminutive, it mocks him. But here's the problem. People like Cheetos.
And they like
And they love their Jesus. They love their Jesus. You put those together, Cheeto and Jesus, and I want to buy a bag, right? And so both of those had the quality that there was something positive or something you could turn around. Now look at his. Low energy Jeb. Can't turn that into a positive. And the moment you heard it, you said, that's an unusual thing to say in the context of politics. And watch how often he uses something that's just out of place. That is part of technique. He is consistently operating in this thin band of wrongness. Not so bad that he must be executed. He's not going to get impeached. It's just always a little not what a president should say, And so that's the first thing he puts in his technique. It's a little bit wrong, so you can't look away. Then he builds in for confirmation bias later. And in this case also contrast, because he had this high energy campaign. Before you heard that, you probably thought, this Jeb Bush guy, he looks like a calm, collected executive, kind of the perfect person you'd want in an emergency. Yeah, I could see that guy as president. The moment you heard low energy and you realized it was a comparison to high energy Trump, you never could see him the same again. It was over. Yeah. And same with his other nicknames, Crooked Hillary. Once he laid that on her, you could guarantee something would come up about the foundation or the email server. Doesn't matter if any of it's true. It didn't matter. You would be drawn to that nickname, and it would be reinforcing.
When you say it doesn't matter, you'd be drawn. How broadly do you mean that? In other words, do you have to be somewhat inclined toward him for it to really work, or will it sort of work with everybody?
Well, in the context of a presidential race, you're going to get something like 50-50 no matter what, right? That's the part where, facts don't matter.
Right. You sort of start there, and then it's...
Facts don't matter to our decisions. They obviously matter to the outcomes. But if people were really looking at facts and using logic, we'd probably have more like an 80-20. 20% just aren't paying attention, but the others got it right. So really, you're trying to persuade maybe 2% of the public who can be persuaded, the people who have not, locked down a commitment, over 18 months. And when you have the best persuader the world may have ever seen, and I know not everybody's buying into this concept yet, but trust me. Or as he says, it's true. And you've got 18 months to work on the public, and you have nonstop coverage, you're going to get that done, and that's what happened.
Okay. And by the way, you didn't, as I pointed out, you didn't just say you predicted he'd win. You predicted that there was a 98% chance he would win, and how early did you do that? I referenced it to Nate Silver, but how early was that?
It was 2015.
Okay.
Yeah, it was early.
You got that?
And it was at the same time you said the 2%. Now, I also am trained in persuasion, as you've heard. Why did I pick 98%? Is it because I did the math? No.
Facts don't matter.
It's because Nate Silver said 2%, and you couldn't get that connection out of your head. And I also intentionally tied my reputation to the most respected, predictor in the field, so that it was easy to imagine us at the same time, and I would get some of his goodness on me.
Right. In other words, this was new business for you, and so you bask in the the sentences that say 98 when he says 2.
I often say that one of the tells, one of the signals for someone who's trained in persuasion is that they can change fields without practice. You can become president without being a candidate, without being a politician. He became a reality TV star without any practice. Steve Jobs didn't go to college. He formed, Apple Computer, and then a few other businesses that also succeeded. So the people who have persuasion talent tend to be fluid across fields in a way that other people are not.
Let me ask you this. As I said, as I watched him, I was both mesmerized, horrified, impressed, all of that with what he was able to do, including upending people's worldviews. He would say, yesterday you thought this is the way the world worked, this is the way you thought politics worked, this is the way you thought candidates worked. And so even if he lost, his persuasion abilities would be worth a book. It wouldn't sell as well, obviously. But I also believe that a marginally smarter campaign in the Rust Belt might have beaten him. And what happens to your prediction of 98% then?
I wouldn't be here.
And the book wouldn't, and you'd be full-time Dilbert.
I'm not stupid. It was the sort of thing that if I'd been wrong, I would have been embarrassed for a year and I would live through it. But I have an unnatural ability to deal with shame. It's a practiced skill. I could disrobe in front of this. I'm not going to. Don't worry. But I was like everybody else with a normal sense of embarrassment. But it's actually a learned skill. You can actually, train it on it yourself.
So what I hear there is you're complimenting him as the master, but you're in choosing the book, in choosing the 98%, in going out on a limb. You're following many of the same techniques.
Yeah, I consider myself a commercial grade persuader, meaning I use it in my work. And I contrast that to, say, a cognitive scientist, who, if you hear anybody say that I got something wrong and they're a cognitive scientist, don't believe me, believe the cognitive scientist. And then above the cognitive scientist are the master persuaders who are bringing a full package. There's something about their personality, their risk-taking. There's something bigger than just the persuasion skills. And
you Steve Jobs, you referred to, but you say, that notion that he has a distortion field around him, which is what they've said about him. Yeah. That, to you, is the description of a master persuader.
Yeah, if you hear anybody has a reality distortions field, they have skills, and Jobs had them.
Once you're focused on this, you're thinking about it, you're blogging about it, you're writing about it, did you then go back and try to figure out how did this happen? In other words, how did he become a master persuader?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know his pastor when he was a kid was Norman Vincent Peale, and he had a close connection to the most motivational best-selling author who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. And he really was the person in America who brought that idea that you could think your way to a better situation, that there was something about the way you framed your existence that would make you more effective. And you see that in Trump. For example, the other day, my favorite example, he was in an interview and he said, well, we had 3% GDP, that was great, but without the hurricane, it probably would have been 4%. I think without, we'll have 4% pretty soon. Now a normal president would have said, hey, we got 3%, right? It was great. But he's already talked the economy into 4%. And who's watching? The people who invest. The people who invest is like, yeah, maybe 4%, I better start investing. And that's what makes it 4%. He was actually Norman Vincent Peeling the whole economy because the economy moves on psychology because there's no resource shortage here, right? So he had that going. He had a father who was a successful business person, probably knew negotiating, probably saw it firsthand. He wrote a book, this Trump, on negotiating, which is
the art of the deal.
Obviously, he knows branding. He knows sales. He knows marketing. He has a sense of humor. These are all related. He's a great communicator. He's quick on his feet. He's even tall, and he's got something going on up here that you can't look away. Watch how many persuaders have something weird going on up there. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but So yeah, he has the full package of skills on top of his personality and just his size. There's something about the size.
It does. I mean, for a long time, reading your book actually made me stop and think about this because I've often thought he was sort of a savant. That he just, my God, I watch him play a crowd, and it's like, where did he get that? But you're saying Norman Vincent Peale, and you're guessing that to become what he's become, he's been working at this.
Yeah, if you write a book about how to negotiate,
yeah,
it's important to you.
Yeah,
it's core to his being.
Let me ask about Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders drew crowds at least as big as Trump's. He elicited the similar kind of passion and loyalty. And I'd say two things he does that I find effective is he does deal in narratives. He really does. There's a narrative of class and history and all of that. He comes across as very authentic in contrast to most politicians. In fact, rough, sort of in his, he's not polished. But he doesn't seem to me to be the persuader Trump is. What's your, how do you see?
Well, Donna Brazil probably has a better answer for what happened to Bernie, but wouldn't you agree, let's poll the audience, wouldn't you agree that Bernie outperformed compared to what you expected? Wouldn't you say? Right.
Yes.
Now, and did you notice, maybe you didn't, that Hillary Clinton's persuasion game was pathetic until he dropped down? Did you notice that? That she got weapons grade over the summer, the final summer. There was just a real change, and it happened instantly. She went from, let me tell you about my boring policy.
And check my website.
Yeah.
I'm not even really going to tell you about it.
And then she went to, he's dark. He's going to destroy the world with nuclear weapons. She went fear, which is your ultimate persuasion. And that word dark, as soon as I saw it, and all the pundits had gotten the memo, and they all started using it, it's a dark speech after the Republican convention. Dark, dark, dark. I said, I think I know who's advising her. And I think he was advising Bernie before. Because remember, Bernie had the most award-winning campaign ad. It was the one where it was a Simon and Garfunkel song.
Oh, yeah. America.
People streaming. Like, I got chills when I watched it. That was so good. And he had all the game. And then suddenly she went from nothing to something. And I speculated that one of the greatest persuaders of all time may have joined her team after leaving the sinking Bernie ship. I had been calling him Godzilla in my blogs.
Sort of like Deep Throat.
Because I didn't want to name him. Because I wasn't sure.
Right.
But I thought I saw the fingerprint on the work. And I had seen a book called Persuasion before most people had from Robert Cialdini, the person who wrote Influence, the most influential book about how to influence. And Persuasion talked about things like using that word dark that would just prime you to see things in a different way. And I thought, I see his fingerprint. And so finally, I finally said it publicly, and I said it to a reporter at one point, and he tracked him down and asked for a comment, and asked him, are you consulting for Clinton? And his comment was, no comment. Now, if you're not consulting for a presidential campaign, do you say no comment? I don't think so. And then some of his associates confirmed that he in fact was. Now keep in mind, I picked that up from one word because that word was so well chosen.
Yes.
And I recognized it from his writing. I had an advanced copy of his book, which was a mistake for him because I caught him. But I think people who had the same training I had could have also recognized it. So it wasn't magic, it was a result of training.
But, I mean, did some of the things that I saw in Bernie probably, with or without Cialdini, the sort of raw, authentic, passionate, I mean, does that fall into, how does that fall into persuasion, those sorts of qualities?
Working against him, he didn't have a good physical.
No.
The visual wasn't good. His hair was always, some version.
Well,
of
but
this.
the crazy hair, sometimes good.
Well, yeah. Maybe it needs to be a little crazier or more orange. But yeah, his biggest secret was he was promising people free money for nothing. And you don't have to be the best persuader in the world.
If you say free college,
free college,
you're going to get young people out at your rallies.
Free health care, free college. You're going to get some energy. But yeah, I mean, he obviously had a good advisor.
Okay. I've got lots of questions. Let me ask one right now. It seems, if I watch Trump right now, that his most successful moves are executive orders and choosing a Supreme Court justice, neither of which call for much persuasion. Who is he persuading these days besides his base?
Well, keep in mind, he didn't get to do those things you mentioned until he persuaded enough people to become president.
That's right. But my question is, who is he persuading now? How is it working for him now?
So now it's a whole different bag of persuasion. So he has to keep persuading his base. Even the Republican senators who hate him and can't stop talking about, what a bad person he is, when you say, but are you going to vote for the things he wants? Oh, yeah, we're going to vote for him. Sure, yeah, we're going to vote his way. So he has the entire Republican side pretty much, dancing the way he wants.
And in some sense, because of his base.
Right.
As long as his base is passionate, they're scared.
Right. Now, if we go on a point-by-point level, I'll just mention a few. Is he persuading ISIS? Now, compare President Obama's approach, which was, hey, we're going to leave in X date, which just persuades ISIS to stay around. We just wait them out. Trump came in and said, bad persuasion. We're going to say we're here forever, and we're not going to just chase you. We're going to destroy you. And we're seeing the first, surrenders. They used to fight to the death. Now, we don't know if that's a trend yet, but we're seeing them. And ISIS has largely been wiped out. Part of the persuasion was the way he treated the military. He said, Mattis, you know how to do this, I don't. Figure it out, and I would expect that the morale of the military who are actually, in the fight over there, probably the best it's ever been. That's persuasion. So ISIS is a successful persuasion. Certainly the economy, he has talked up. Yes, Obama is responsible for 75% of the good times. I give him a solid grade. Obama was great. He was a master persuader.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was the right person in the right time. In 2009, when things were going to hell, you don't want the orange-haired guy. All right, you don't.
You don't want the flamethrower.
Right. You want the lawyer who says it's going to be okay. I've looked into it. I'm going to make this work. So he gets credit for the strong base. But clearly, there's a Trump bump to the economy. And that has everything to do with his persuasion.
Okay.
So now you've got ISIS and the economy. Those are both directly, and I think pretty demonstrably true, that persuasion is a big part of that. Now he's in China. China loves him. They love him. He's a rock star over there. He clearly is persuading, and it works both ways, right? She is persuading him, he's persuading him back. But they have this lovely dance just at the time that this alliance is crucial to deal with North Korea. Let's talk about North Korea. Are they persuaded? Well, I've got a feeling that Little Rocket Man, for the first time, doesn't know if he'll be alive in a month. That has never been the case before, I would guess. And that does make a difference.
Unlike his brother.
Yeah. You don't want to be related, that's for sure. So I would say there's maybe for the first time, a chance that something could happen in North Korea if you count China's persuasion that's moving in the right direction with the economy. So that's looking good. What other topics you got? I mean,
I guess you could have health care or tax cuts.
So let's talk about health care. So health care, you notice he stood back and let Congress take the lead. He basically didn't persuade. Not really. I mean, he didn't put any effort into it. He didn't even care what it was. He said, bring something to my desk.
That's true.
You've had years to work on this. Where the hell's my bill? He said, Republicans, I'm the guy who signs it, right? My part, I can do my part. You just bring me something I can sign. And they didn't. But the only way you're ever going to get a health care bill is the way he played it, which is let the Republicans go first with their big majority, fail hard, try again, fail hard, realize they have no hope. Meanwhile, scare the pants off the left because they're watching what the Republicans have in mind and like, no, not that. And then what does he do when they failed and these guys are scared? he says, maybe I should talk to the Democrats. If you're saying to yourself, he hasn't gotten health care done in the time you hoped it would be done, true enough, all right? But was there a deadline for that? He's letting Obamacare fail. That's part of the persuasion. He's taking it to the end until...
The way he's sabotaging it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So essentially, he's making things worse until there's desperation, and people are ready for somebody to come in and say, look, the only way this works is if you guys meet in the middle, and you've never been willing to do that until now.
And are you guessing that he can't predict exactly how all this is going to play out. If it looked like health care was the most important issue in a lot of the elections that Democrats won this week, where it used to be an anchor, it's now an asset, if that plays out in 2018, and it isn't a Republican, a good Republican midterm, it's a good Democrat midterm, in some sense, there's that thing you talk about, 2 ways to win, no way to lose. I have a feeling, I always have this feeling, that that's ultimately where he is. His brand survives no matter what happens to the Republicans.
Well, I think he's actually going to come out ahead if he gets a mixed Congress. I think the surprise would be if the Democrats had some big wins and the Republicans lost the majority in at least one of the places. I think he'd have a better chance of negotiating something in the middle. I don't think that's worse for him, because the worst case is a Republican majority shoving something down the throats of the left and the rest of the country.
Yeah.
Nobody can really be comfortable with that. You need somebody to come on the other side.
Yeah, interesting. Let me get back to sort of the foundation of this. You write, this one line I pulled out, humans think they are rational and they think they understand their reality. They are wrong on both counts. And it was my sense that humans think they're rational, they're wrong, they think they understand the reality, they're wrong, is the foundation for everything else in this book.
Yeah. One of the things you learn as a hypnotist is that the common view of the world is exactly upside down. And what I mean is that the common view is that humans are rational creatures, we use reason, we look at facts, maybe 90% of the time. 10% of the time, we get a little crazy, but we figure, that doesn't happen to us, that's other people. The hypnotist turns that around and says, we are irrational 90% of the time and don't know it, because we're rationalizing after the fact. And only 10% in like little ridiculous things like balancing your checkbook or searching for the best price online, that's rational. There's no emotional content. But until you understand that we're irrational, you can't even be a hypnotist, because nothing would make sense. The things you do would have no logical basis.
Yeah, you can't believe it's going to work.
Now, I learned this, many decades ago, before there was scientific backing for it. So it was sort of the hypnotists just say, just act like it's true and watch what happens, right? They didn't try to, put a science on it. But now there's books like Nudge, Influence, Persuasion. There's tons of science showing that humans don't use rational thought to make decisions. And you can see it yourself. If half the country is going to go the way they're going to go no matter who runs, how much fact and logic is in any of those decisions? If you go to the grocery store, there's people with 5 different religions shopping next to you. Some think they reincarnated, some think they're going to live forever, some think there's no heaven. These are completely different realities. But yet, they can all buy groceries. They can all procreate. So it turns out that evolution never cared if you actually understood your reality. It cared if you could make more of yourself, and that was a very low bar.
Mm-hmm. You certainly say, as he said to you folks, he said if you read something that a cognitive scientist or an evolutionary psychologist says that differs from what I say, then trust them. Are there any in particular that you recommend? Besides if they were to read something else in this realm besides Win Bigly?
Yeah, if you just Google the phrase Persuasion reading list, you will come up with my list. It's the first search term. So Persuasion reading list, and it's a whole bunch of persuasion-related books.
Okay, very good. Let me ask you about a couple of the things that we may have mentioned or may not, but falling from that fact that we're not rational and so on. One of the key things you've mentioned, confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias, and an example?
So confirmation bias is the human tendency to think that all evidence supports your preconceived notion, right? So we're watching the Russia stuff. You know, there's some Hillary stuff and there's some Trump stuff. Depending on which side you're on, you're going to believe that all the stuff on the other side is definitely true. And all the stuff about your candidate, well, that can't be true. That's just crazy. And, you know, it has nothing to do with the facts because we really don't have access to the facts in any of that stuff.
But but I think, lest anyone think that this is when you're looking at politics, this is what we do when we're in high school and we think a girl likes us or we don't, right? I mean, it's like,
yeah,
I mean, it's everything, isn't it?
Yeah, once you realize it's not the exception, I've talked about that and cognitive dissonance as essentially the operating system for the human mind. These are not the flaws in the operating system. This is the operating system. Right? This is our normal. Yeah.
Yeah. Cognitive dissonance.
So cognitive dissonance is almost hard to believe if you haven't been exposed to it. But I think after the Trump experience, most people have heard the term. And it refers to the fact that if something violates your sense of what is true, especially if it's about yourself, you will instantly rewrite the movie in your head to reinterpret it, and sometimes ridiculously so, until it's just something that other people will look at and say, well, I think you've lost it. You are now crazy. But the person who's in it thinks it's perfectly rational. It only looks crazy on the outside. Now, again, if you think, well, that sounds like a terrible thing to happen to other people, you're missing the point, right? We're all in our bubble.
Yeah, those poor folks.
We're all in our bubble all the time.
But an example in not in the campaign, but in our own life of cognitive dissonance.
So if you knew, say, a cigarette smoker, you say, hey, why don't you quit smoking? Now, people don't like to think of themselves as having no willpower. They don't like to think of themselves as not being aware of the science that it's going to kill you. So you get crazy answers like, well, I knew somebody who smoked 3 packs a day and they had 15 barbecues and drank 10 beers and lived to 110. So, so what?
Right.
So what? How's that? What's that got to do with you?
Yeah, got it. You mentioned this thing about visual persuasion. Is that if you can say something which makes something appear in someone else's mind's eye, if you will, this is, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, a visual piece of persuasion is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah, so if you were to rank the different types of persuasion, fear is always the top because, if you don't take care of your fear, you can't really do anything else. But within the non-fear category, visual persuasion is very powerful. And it's powerful because we're visual creatures. So the visual part of your mind just sort of overrules the other parts. So look at, imagine if candidate Trump did not have this visual persuasion and he was describing border security. He might have said,
yes,
well, we'd like tighter border security. We're going to use a variety of means. It depends on the terrain. In some terrain, we do this. In some terrain, we do that. No, he said, we're building a wall. Right? We all see a wall. As soon as he says that, we're all presenting the wall.
A big, beautiful.
Right. And then it gets better. More technique. He says, and I'm going to make Mexico pay for it. Right? Now again, he's in that narrow band of wrongness. You go, well, that's wrong. That can't be right. But maybe. Well, it's wrong. Well, but maybe. And so you obsess on it. And while you're thinking about the question of,
we're now arguing about who's going to pay for the wall.
Yeah, once you argue about who's paying for it, you have uncritically somewhat accepted, well, there's going to be some kind of wall. But how the hell are we paying for that thing? Right? And you'll see him use that technique a lot. It's making you think past the sale is the technique.
So by the way, in the book, as I said at the top, these things are laid out like this. So you can get it, you can stew about the campaign, you can get either excited or fume or whatever you want, but he also is delivering for you how you can use these same techniques.
Try to make it useful, yes.
In your own life. One thing that I found curious was you cite sense of humor as one of his assets, one of his talents, and yet I've heard a number of people say, I don't think I've ever seen him laugh. What's going on there?
I heard somebody say that, and I think I might have said it somewhere on a Periscope or something, and immediately people sent me links of him laughing.
But it's rare, considering how much we've seen him on screen.
Perhaps in public it is rare.
Yeah.
But nobody has that fine a sense of humor and also doesn't laugh. That would be very unusual, I think.
Yeah. And the sense of humor is in things like the Rosie O'Donnell line, which just came, an improver couldn't come up with it quicker.
So one thing that people don't understand about his sense of humor, and I feel like I have a little advantage there because I grew up in upstate New York, and there's definitely a regional sense of humor. There are things that New Yorkers would say and do that would be appalling to Californians. So having seen both worlds, I've got a flavor of that. My favorite example was the John McCain joke. I prefer people who don't get caught. Now, with all due respect to the people in the military and the veterans, I don't mean any disrespect, but that is a well-known joke form. He was simply reminded of a common joke. And what makes that funny to the people who laugh?
Who find it funny?
The people who laughed at home, because you don't
Right.
laugh in front of other people at that joke.
That's right.
What makes it funny is the wrongness of it, all right? So the people who are laughing at that are not laughing at McCain. They're not laughing at veterans. They're laughing at how completely wrong that was to say, and he knew that it was wrong when he said it. That's why it was funny. It was completely a bad move. Like that was, I don't count that in his wins on the persuasion front.
Right.
That was just a mistake. He does have some mistakes. But it was based on that. I think he had a blind spot, because in New York it's a little funnier than it is in California.
Right. One thing I found interesting, Scott talks about his own, just sort of at the very up front, he says, well, this is sort of my politics. And another interesting one for me, which I don't think we'll get into, is these are my filters. I found that very interesting. So if we get a second after I ask you this one, let me ask you about those filters, because it is fascinating. But you said you don't vote. Why not?
Correct. So when you learn persuasion, one of the things that you learn, and this is one of the stronger effects, is that as soon as you join a team, you vote for the team, and you start confirmation bias will make you think that everything the team does is smart and brilliant. So I try to keep myself unaligned from an identifiable team to try to preserve what little I can of my objectivity. Now, I'm not blind to the fact that I am a human being, and therefore I may have an exaggerated sense of how objective I can be. But I do what I can, right? There are things you can do to at least try to be objective, and that's one of them.
Well, but I'm going to press you on that, because it doesn't seem to me that voting even says you're on a team. It says that when it came down to it that day, you made a choice, but it doesn't mean,
But you don't want your choice to do poorly. But by the time, and you've made your decision way ahead of time, all right? Now, likewise, because I was...
So you're saying that the act of voting is not it. It's that once you're in that mode, as you said, you're sort of rooting. You begin to...
Very few people made up their mind in the voting booth.
Oh,
This happened,
Yeah.
long before that. So yeah, you're reinforcing your bias for months and months before that.
So would we have a problem if everyone began to go, I want to be objective in this?
Well, if nobody else voted, I would vote.
Because, boy, the value of your vote would go way up. Yeah. I found one interesting statistic. Trump won 49 to 29 among those who didn't like either candidate. That's a huge victory. What does that have to do with persuasion?
So this is the first president whose popularity, when they do the polls, or approval, let's use the word approval, whose approval may forever stay in the toilet, while people's assumption about how he's doing in the job could float much higher. There's going to be this huge disconnect. We already see it. Because you see, for example, consumer confidence and Wall Street confidence, the stock market. there are people who are judging the biggest issues as being quite competent. But when they look at the approval, they say, do you approve of him? And they think of something he said that was, unkind, that was over the line, and they say, I can't approve of that. I like my 401k, but that's a separate question.
Wait,
I don't approve of it.
couldn't his incompetence, and I'll put it in quotes since we don't necessarily agree on that, couldn't that be what buffers us from the effects of what we don't approve of? In other words, if he doesn't really get anything done, then the stock market might as well do what it does because he's not as relevant as if he were micromanaging.
Well, keep in mind, and this is a fascinating thing, if I have a conversation with someone who is a very anti-Trumper, they can say, what has he done? And I'll make a list that's this long, and a minute and a half later, that person who just saw the list will say, but he hasn't gotten anything done. And I think that's my perfect example of what I call the two movies on one screen. We literally are seeing a different movie, even though we're in the same theater. And I had predicted over a year ago that the way that this year would play out is it would start on Inauguration Day with, my God, we've elected Hitler, it's Hitler, it's Hitler, march in the streets, it's terrible. But after a few months of no Hitler stuff, just being sort of a normal president, people would say, all right, he didn't round up anybody and put them in concentration camps. It doesn't look like anything like that's going to happen, but he's totally incompetent. So they change to the next thing. He's incompetent, there's chaos. But after the summer, and we start to see some accomplishments, ISIS, the economy, maybe some movement with North Korea. Healthcare is still going to be problematic, but people think that's Congress. In our minds, we think that's a little more of a Congress.
And partly, by the way, he dealt with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But at the end of the year, all the news organizations are going to start putting together their lists of what happened. And it's going to be a long list. You're not going to like it because it's going to be Republican stuff. And if you're not one, you're going to say, well, I don't like that stuff. But it's going to be a long list, and that will be really interesting. And I predicted that by that time, people would say, all right, he did get a lot done. He was effective, but we don't like the things he's doing. We don't like the regulations he's cut. But he did cut a lot of them. Right, and that stuff Republicans want.
Right. No, I mean, just as I watch, it's that the appointments he made of people, who wanted to do away with the agencies they're running, are doing that. I mean, that will make up a great deal of the long list. Is that what Pruitt's doing and Perry's doing, and so on and so on?
Yeah. It's interesting how many executive orders he's signed that I don't see a lot of analysis of all the damage it's doing. Now, I assume that they're not all good. I mean, on paper, some of them look like really bad ideas to get rid of this regulation or this protection. On the surface, they don't look like good ideas, but you also don't hear the counterpoint.
Well, it's getting nerdy, but partially it's that an executive order only starts the ball rolling. The actual, that's one of the things about the wonderful flourish when you hold it up. It's as if it's done. And in fact, all that does is it begins to move some levers, right. And the bad effects or good effects aren't going to show up for months or years, right. And so on. Ted, are we about ready to go to questions? Okay. I will let Ted take it from here.
So it's time for questions. The rules around here are questions generally start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are typically short. There is no such thing as a two-part question, and only Terrence McNally tonight gets to ask follow-up questions.
Got it. Thank you, Scott. Question on Godzilla. You say that you think Cialdini was helping Hillary, but you never mentioned, did he stop helping Hillary? I don't understand if he was helping. Did it stop at some point because we didn't see the, let's say, the wave overcome Donald Trump? So could you comment on that?
Well, toward the end, you had two of the best persuaders, going head to head, and sometimes King Kong beats Godzilla, and I think that's what happened. I had predicted more of a landslide kind of win by Trump, and I was actually surprised, that it was as close as it was. But I wasn't totally surprised because by the summer before the election, when she started the dark persuasion, I recognize that as weapons grade, and I thought, okay, now this is a whole new game. If she had kept on the way she started, let me tell you about my policies, and by the way, I'm a woman. Elect me because I'm a woman. That was just, that would have been annihilation by election day. But she upped her game.
Okay, next question here on your right.
Thank you. Hi, if we're 90% irrational, over here, whoops, this way.
Oh, okay.
Hi. If we're 90% irrational, what's your irrational thinking?
I don't understand that.
Well, if we're being irrational, what are you being irrational about?
What things in general am I irrational about?
Yes.
The beauty is that the only person who can't tell is the person you ask the question of, right? So, like, if I could recognize my own irrationality, I'd say, whoa, I better cut this out right now. Yeah, let's use some facts. So no, that's the unanswerable question. We're all potentially in our own little bubble, and we can't tell.
What do you think Trump's chances are in 2020?
I'm not convinced he would run in 2020 if he has a really good 4 years. And things are lining up that if he gets a little motion on North Korea, maybe that looks a little better, and there's something that looks like healthcare, and the economy stays strong and ISIS stays beaten, he's going to be unbeatable, but he also knows how to go out on top. So given his age, which is a real concern that will only get worse, especially, he'd be hitting that age range where it's hard to believe there's not a problem.
Right.
Like, your best supporter is going to say, I don't know, was that clever or was that something else? So his best play to preserve the Trump brand and his presidency might be one term. But he's also competitive as hell. So if there's something undone that he thinks he could do, he might be just a pit bull and just say, all right, give me 4 more years, I'll try to get this other thing done. So I think maybe a 50% chance he'll even run no matter how his 4 years go.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for coming down.
Hi, Jessica.
I wanted to ask, what is your technique for looking for confirmation bias in the news, given all of the fake news that keeps coming out?
Yeah, so the first thing I do is when I see something reported that's new and maybe a head scratcher, I check the other networks, because the networks are pretty good at getting the facts right? Just the basic facts. What they're terrible at is a non-biased interpretation, because they use the amount of time they spend on one thing versus the other, the number of guests, the type of guests they have on, and what those guests say. So they bury the facts with opinion, and so I just try to sample both sides. And it really, if you go between Fox News and CNN, you are changing universes. Like
MSNBC even more so.
Yeah, even more so. So I try to stick to the facts and see both sides of the confirmation bias. And then if I see that there's two completely believable interpretations, but completely different, I tend not to believe either one, right? Because that just tells you it's easy to come up with any story that fits these facts, which is often the case.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for coming out right here. Do you have any predictions you're willing to divulge outside of the political arena?
Yeah, so this is probably my prediction that's least likely to come true. But I'm going to put it out there anyway, because I think I mentioned I don't have shame like regular people. The football kneelers, I think that by the end of the year, the full season, that the teams who knelt, or had more people kneeling, will underperform, meaning that they won't beat the spread. All right, that doesn't mean they'll win, because the better team is still going to usually win. But I think that that's enough of a distraction and a mental distraction. First of all, you can't really do two important things at the same time. Your brain isn't good at doing two things. And the kneeling would take you out of the football mode and put you in sort of a whole other mode, and people are looking at you. And then there's the hatred from your own fans. The home court advantage is sort of sacrificed if your fans are saying, I used to like football, but I hate that asshole. They're going to be really angry. That's got to hurt. And I also think that there's something about the physical act of getting on one knee. that might activate, here's the speculative part, that might activate the part of your brain that is sort of submissive.
Subjugated.
Subjugated. It's like, the king is not the one who kneels. The winner is not the one who kneels. Now, yes, I understand that is an act of defiance, and in this this specific context, it is actually a strong. It's
The kneeling is an act of.
But here's the thing: day one, it's strong. By the 12th week, you're just kneeling, right? And here's the thing: your body and your brain are pretty connected. There's research that says that if you force yourself to smile, your happiness chemistry in your brain can be activated the same way it works in reverse. If you're happy, you'll smile, but if you smile, you can actually cause yourself to be happy.
When you just said the thing about you not, I'm jumping in here for a second, but there's one that I wanted to ask that I forgot, which is you said the thing about you lacking shame, having trained yourself and you say the same thing about Trump. One reason that he can be so wrong is that it doesn't matter. As I watch him, it seems to me he is both thin-skinned and thick-skinned, that he's both hypersensitive and a bull. What's that about?
Confirmation bias. Here's the thing. Can you imagine that he didn't know how he would be treated when he ran for president? He made this choice to be just, shat upon for years.
And to start out with the whole rapist thing in the first 5 minutes.
Everything just indicates that he knew what he was getting into, and he was okay with it. Now, the thing you call thin-skinned is that anytime somebody attacks him, he immediately responds. That's sort of how you interpret the
And in some
thing,
sense,
right?
it seems out of proportion. And why did that, that's just a flea. Why act like it was a...
But here's the thing. You notice it's, at least within the context of the campaign and through now, the people he attacks are the professionals. All right? He's not going after a citizen who said something on social media. He's going after professional journalists, writers, politicians, and in the case of, say, the cons, who were part of the...
They were professional by association because they appeared?
They were professional in that context. They were doing a political public thing for political people. The technique here is that I had a coworker who became the model for the Alice character in my strip, who I first saw this technique. Let me tell you her technique, and then you'll see it in Trump. If somebody did something she wanted, that was like a favor or something, she would immediately go to their boss and say, "You've got the best employee. You should promote this person," because they were doing what she wanted, appear, right? But if somebody didn't do what she wanted, she would go to the boss and she'd say, "You got to get rid of this idiot. This is horrible. It's the worst thing. Get rid of him." So she would create this giant difference, the gap, the contrast. Everything about Persuasion is contrast, right? What's the bad thing? What's the good thing? And everybody knew that making her happy meant she would give you flowers in the office, literally. She'd bring you flowers. She would praise you. She would get you promoted. Literally, she got people promoted for doing what she wanted. And she had amazing control over the office at the same level as her peers because of that. When somebody does something that Trump likes, for example, when I was on CNN, he liked what I said, and apparently he was watching from Air Force One, and the message came through. Smirkanish got the message. He was the one interviewing me, and I got the word that he liked it, and also Smirkanish got the word that he liked it, or that he was watching anyway, which is the same thing. And so he compliments and helps the people who help him, and he goes hard every time. Every time. Doesn't matter if you're a Republican.
Right.
Doesn't matter. But if you have to be a professional, right? If you see him going after somebody said something on social media, then you got to worry, right? Because that wouldn't be technique. That would be thin-skinned. But as long as he keeps that line, I think you're okay.
Okay.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, Scott. My question is, how will Trump persuade Robert Mueller?
Well, that's a good question. Let me give you a related story, so you can maybe fill in the blanks here. Do you remember when he said that awful thing about Judge Curiel? And he said, I'm not sure, paraphrasing, I don't think I'll get a fair trial because he's Mexican. And everybody said, my God, what a racist. He's saying that he can't be a fair judge because he's Mexican. Of course, that wasn't what was going on. Here's what was going on. If you talk to your neighbor and say, hey, neighbor, tell me a little about yourself, there's a good chance your neighbor will say, well, we're Italian. But it means they were all born in America. They just have Italian heritage. The way people talk about themselves is exactly the way Trump talked about Judge Curiel. I was at dinner not long ago where a young man said he was describing himself, and he said he was Mexican. He's like 3 generations born in this country, and he was 20% Mexican, but he said, I'm Mexican. It's the way people talk about themselves. So first of all, he was using a shorthand that is sort of the common language, but it was a big mistake. However, by bringing up the potential bias, which is common in the legal context, very uncommon in the political context, and wrong in every way, but in a legal context, which was more important to him at the moment, bias is very important. So you point it out. And then what happened when Judge Curiel had to rule on when the trial would be held? It could have been before the election, which would have been a disaster. And that's normally when it would have been, because there's no reason to push it out. But instead, Judge Curiel gave him a little extra consideration, and he put it after the election. And it might have well been the difference between winning and losing the election. Now, did Judge Curiel have to do that? He didn't. Was he treating him like every other person in the legal system? I don't think so. I think he gave him a little extra consideration there. Would he have done that if the president had not called out to the entire world that this judge might be biased? He took away his option. All right. In the context of a legal case, it was brilliant. In the context of the way he worded it, and in a political situation, it just looked like a damn racist, right? But if you ask somebody like Alan Dershowitz, who was on the OJ trial among other things, is bias a legitimate thing to bring up in a legal context? He'd say, hell yes, that's my job. That's what I do. I bring up bias all the time on every level. There's nothing off the table. And certainly if your entire family heritage is in a group that you imagine there might be some people who would not be happy with the judge at the next Thanksgiving, if he ruled in favor of Trump, that's legitimate in a legal context. It's illegitimate in almost every other context, and we would like it that way, right? We don't want it to be part. So the point is about Mueller, look for things that Trump says to be in public to bias Mueller, to make him give the president a little extra consideration because he doesn't want to play into the trap that the president is setting, which is, hey, I'm not sure you're being fair here. So he's going to have to try a little harder to look extra fair.
I mean, one could even say that happened with Comey.
Yeah.
Not the firing, but the coming out on October 28th with we're looking at some new emails.
You could exactly say that, yes. Comey probably was persuaded to flip the opposite direction.
To go above and beyond what he had to do,
right.
So that
Because he was extra good to Clinton at first, and then he went the other way. Yeah, that's probably true.
And our final question for the evening.
Hi, Scott, up here. With your opening question when you came out and asked if this was going to be a hostile audience, I was just wondering if that was a persuasive technique.
Was it a persuasive technique? No, I was hoping it was going to be. Because a hostile audience just has lots of energy. And remember, I have no shame. So it would have been actually kind of fun. I was hoping, for anything short of violence to happen here today. But you've all been extra nice so far. So
I'll tell you a funny thing. We're backstage, and of course, when you're backstage, you can hear things in the audience, and I heard it as murmuring, and you used a word that was much more the rumbling. You were already sort of putting them in that role.
I was hoping.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thanks, Terrence. Thanks, Scott. Thank you all for coming.